Good afternoon, everyone.
If you would take your seats, if you're not there already, I want to begin by saying that we are gathered on the Anishinaabe Algonquin unceded traditional territory for this meeting. Bonjour et bienvenue à la 7e.
Good afternoon and welcome to the 7th meeting of the Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs.
On barriers to Indigenous economic development. Today we have two 45-minute panels with time at the end to consider drafting instructions and committee business. On the first panel we have Robert Louie, Chairman of the First Nation Land Advisory Board, Tina Rasmussen, Corporate Development Officer, Meadow Lake Tribal Council, Industrial Investments, and Stephen Buffalo, Indian Resource Council. Alors, je sais que vous connaissez tout.
I know that you know all the rules about the health recommendations. I won't go over them again, and I know that you know the procedures because this is our 7th meeting, so I won't repeat those either. We will get underway.
And I would like to give the microphone to Mr. Robert Louie, Chairman of the First Nations Land Advisory Board, to make some introductory remarks. Mr. Louie, you have 6 minutes. 5 minutes, I beg your pardon, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, honorable members of the Standing Committee. My name is Robert Louie. I'm speaking to you today as the chairman of the Lands Advisory Board, representing the Framework Agreement on First Nation Land Management across Canada. We work with First Nations across Canada to implement self-governance and to do away with a large portion of the Indian Act. Our First Nation communities pass land codes and take over jurisdictional control of land management. For the most part, the land code and self-governing process has been extremely successful. We have many First Nations success stories in economic development. However, there remain barriers that need to be overcome for self-governance and economic development to properly occur and to gain full momentum. I will speak to 5 of these barriers. Firstly, confusion over the Framework Agreement and the legislation. The Framework Agreement was a 1996 government-to-government agreement entered into between First Nations and Canada, which sets out the principles for land management self-governance to occur. In 1999, the government passed the legislation, and the intent therein was supposed to simply ratify the Framework Agreement. Unfortunately, government drafters either put in extra wording or omitted wording contained in the Framework Agreement. This has consistently caused confusion and clarity interpretation differences to this day. We have worked with government to draft replacement legislation and expect it to be tabled in Parliament relatively soon. Once the legislation is tabled, we ask for all party support to approve it. Secondly, enforcement issues. While the federal government has recognized the authority of First Nations to enact their own laws, there is no federal cooperation to enforce them. This includes federal and provincial court adjudication and prosecution. Government has not, to this date, fully directed the enforcement authorities to enforce First Nation laws. This needs to be remedied. The RCMP have refused to enforce First Nation laws, which has frustrated many First Nation communities. Court adjudication and prosecution of First Nation laws has been unnecessarily absent. We have had meetings with various provincial attorney generals, parliamentary standing committees, and relevant federal ministers. However, this process has been moving along very slowly. Toothless law does not support business or investment. Any recommendations you may make in your report to speed this process up would be sincerely appreciated. Thirdly, land registry issues. The existing Indian Lands Registry system, including the First Nations Land Registrar regulations, is outdated and needs a major upgrade. It is a deeds-based registry that doesn't formally guarantee ownership. There is a lack of consistent document standards and cadastral data that backs land tenure. This, in turn, limits capital and borrowing options and prevents title insurance options. We are working in partnership with the BC Land Title and Survey Authority for more than a year to establish a modern and independent First Nation operated land registry system that will remedy this situation. We are seeking the support of Canada to this proposal. Fourthly, Indian Act legacy issues. There is a huge backlog of outstanding cadastral data and survey uncertainties that need to be resolved. There is a large number of contaminated sites on reserves that require mediation. There are outstanding wills and estates issues that go back many decades that need to be resolved. We need significant government attention and investment to resolve these outstanding barriers to economic prosperity. Lastly, additions to reserves. Many First Nations have lands that are waiting to be added back to their reserves. The addition to reserve process has been mired in complicated, decades-long, expensive, and unnecessary policy. This needs to change quickly in a major way so that First Nations can generate much-needed revenue. Hundreds of millions of dollars in untapped economic development opportunity has been lost. This concludes my presentation. Thank you, honourable members, for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Louis. Ms. Rasmussen, you have the floor for 5 minutes. We think you may be muted. Can you hear? I can't hear. We're having a problem hearing Ms. Rasmussen. You guys can't hear her, right?
Is that any better?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, I just had to change the setting on my laptop, so I'm still okay?
Please go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today on behalf of the 9 nations of the Middle Lake Tribal Council and our Economic Development Corporation, MLTC Industrial Investments. As introduced, my name is Tina Rasmussen. I'm Corporate Development Officer for MLTC, and I'm a proud member of the Flying Dust First Nation and are coming to you today from Treaty Territory 6. You may ask why MLTC Industrial Investments would be on the same stage as some of these very important Indigenous organizations. Well, I think MLTC Industrial Investments is a very good example of boots on the ground company that is attempting to move our 9 First Nations forward in terms of economic development. MLTC Industrial Investments exists to create successful economic development through business investment and development that will generate wealth, employment, and training opportunity while improving the health and prosperity of our shareholders, the 9 nations of the Middle Lake Tribal Council. And coincidentally, our particular tribal council not only is 9 members, but 9 member nations, but we herald from 3 different treaty territories, Treaty 6, Treaty 8, and Treaty 10. I'd like to talk today a little bit about some of the positive things that have been happening in government and some of the things that we think can be moved forward even more so to improve and remove barriers to facilitation of Indigenous economic development. So in effect, basically create a better support system and a way to help level the field for, level the economic playing field for our country for Indigenous people to be able to participate at an equal level that other companies and other communities in this country are able to. So the first, with respect to federal funding, we feel that by implementing the following outcomes, we could improve for First Nations economic development in Canada of a number of things. So we hope that the government will maintain the current funding carve-outs nationally for Indigenous-owned projects. All federal funding for economic development activities across the domains, whether it's infrastructure, renewable energy, natural resources, should maintain a special minimum 10% carve-out reserve for Indigenous business only, special identified, and that this carve-out does not exclude any Indigenous business from accessing funding from larger source or multiple source fundings. Secondly, we'd hope that the government would maintain enhanced grant contribution levels to Indigenous-owned projects. We put forward the most recent NRCan SHREPS project funding where there was a specific $100 million set aside for Indigenous projects, where the Indigenous communities were able to access up to 75% grant funding. And that funding was expended, the $1 billion funding pool was expended in less than a year, just to show you the great need out there. And I believe, if my figures are correct, around 260 million of that was expended to Indigenous projects. So that is a remarkable way to help Indigenous economic development move forward. Thirdly, we'd like to see the creation of access to streamlined business startup funding. It takes much effort from business concept initiation to fully developed shovel-ready project. It would be helpful if federal funding programs provided better support for the early stage costs of project development, your legal, your accounting, your engineering, your miscellaneous expenses. Often the project has to be, in order to access any kind of funding, the project has to be shovel-ready. And in many instances, the First Nations are not always in the best position to be prepared to get that application to that point and to have the funding available to expend all of that revenue to get it to that point. With respect to federal financing, we would hope that the government consider implementing the following: maintain access to sizable financing or term loans with limited security. An example might be to ensure that there is financing support to Indigenous businesses through term loans of $1 million to $5 million, where there's limited security and financing is difficult to achieve and often is very expensive when you're going out into the regular market, especially when you're trying to lift new business opportunities off the ground. We're hoping that the committee will recommend to government as well to expand the First Nations Finance Authority mandate to include First Nations Tribal Council and economic development corporations. I think the tide is changing more so that many First Nations are moving the political side of things away from the business side of things and allowing a lot more business development to happen through their economic development corporations. But as we currently understand, the FNFA is not accessible for tribal councils or economic development corporations. Everything has to be run specifically through the individual First Nation band. Another area that we feel is a barrier.
So, Ms. Rasmussen, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap it up now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. With respect to federal procurement practices, we encourage to simplify the access for Indigenous business to procurement opportunities. It's very cumbersome as it currently exists. And the last one is to firmly promote free trade for Indigenous-owned businesses throughout the Americas, consistent with Indigenous peoples' past history of widespread and free trade systems. We have seen that individual small businesses, which most First Nations communities have, are not considered in these larger free trade issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Rasmussen. Mr. Buffalo, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair and committee members, for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Stephen Buffalo, and I'm the President and CEO of the Indian Resource Council of Canada. Our organization represents over 130 First Nations who produce or have a direct interest in the oil and gas industry. Our mandate is to advocate for federal policies that will improve and increase economic development opportunities for the First Nations and their members. We also play an oversight role with Indian Oil and Gas Canada, a federal special operating agency, to ensure they fulfill their legal and fiduciary roles in management and regulation of oil and gas resources. And right off the bat, I must say, the Indian Oil and Gas Canada is doing a very bad job as a regulator and a fiduciary. And in that sense, they are, in fact, one of the major barriers to our economic development and energy development. Our communities benefit from involvement in oil and gas. The relationship with mainstream industry has not always been perfect, but is getting better. We are more involved in oil and gas jobs, in reclamation such as the First Nations Site Rehabilitation Program, in procurement, and in equity participation more than ever. There isn't another industry in the country that has engaged Indigenous peoples more meaningfully in terms of scale of own source revenue as oil and gas. And that's a fact. That's why it's so important to our economic development and self-determination that Canada has a healthy and competitive oil and gas sector. But it often feels that Canada is trying to eliminate the sector instead of supporting it. The overruns on TMX with Indigenous groups wanting to buy it, the cancellation of Keystone XL, the cancellation of Northern Gateway, the tanker ban, the Impact Assessment Act C-69, the lack of LNG export capacity, the cancellation of Tech Frontier Mine, the tens of millions we've lost in royalties in the past decade due to differential in price between Western Canadian Select and Brent crude during the COVID-19 pandemic. These have directly harmed our communities, costing First Nations in millions of lost source revenue. I think everyone on this committee knows that no communities can afford that. The loss of own source revenues and royalties is one thing. But on top of that, these missed opportunities have cost our people jobs and procurement opportunities that would probably number in the billions. We look at the support or the dependency of federal funding under the Indian Act. From 2010 to 2015, it rose from 33% to 36%. That's got to change. When you talk about economic development, that's what's important. Getting our people good paying jobs, getting First Nations owned business, big contracts from trucking to catering to earth moving and reclamation. So they can grow their business and hire more people, creating opportunities for entrepreneurs. There's no sector, no solar panel installation, not tourism, not golf courses that can replace economic opportunity that the oil and gas provides for First Nations. The biggest barrier you can eliminate in Indigenous economic development is stop hampering or choking out the oil and gas sector. And I note that the government is now considering a cap emission, which if drafted not properly, will in practice be a cap on production. Instead, I ask you to promote and encourage our involvement by making sure First Nations have access to capital. We need to be real partners in new projects. I know you've heard from others, and I know we'll hear, but that's the issue. I am also the chair of the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, which was created by the government of Alberta to address some of the access to capital challenge I mentioned. We've been able to provide many First Nations the capital needed to participate in power plants, carbon capture facilities, pipelines, and more. But at the federal level, some people consider this government-backed loan to Indigenous communities to get involved in these things to be fossil fuel subsidy, which it is not. The federal government is truly committed to reconciliation and the principles of UNDRIP, and it should be supportive in whatever kind of economic development we want to be a part of, regardless of the industry. Government shouldn't be picking and choosing for us. For our members and many other First Nations, oil and gas provides the best opportunity for economic well-being. It doesn't mean that we aren't interested in other sectors, nor that we don't want to be part of the net zero economy. We can and should strike a balance between economic development and a net zero economy. I look forward to your questions, and thank you very much from this today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Buffalo. We'll now proceed with the first round of questions. And so, Mr. Vidal, you have 6 minutes from the Conservatives.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all of our witnesses today. I have 6 minutes, as the Chair said. So many questions, so little time. So I'm going to try to be brief with my questions and try to get a few in here for all of you. In earlier meetings, we heard testimony about Indigenous procurement and targets and some of the challenges. Ms. Rasmussen, I know from some of our prior meetings that I've had with your organization, Metal Lake Tribal Council, one of your businesses, Polar Oils, has been having some issues in getting through the procurement process. Would you mind just briefly sharing that story and maybe offer a bit of a solution? I know you referred to it in your comments about some of the bureaucracy and the challenges. If you would just maybe share that quick story so we could learn something from that.
Yes, thanks very much for the question. Gary is correct. MP Vidal is correct. We do have a company called Polar Oils. Polar Oils is a fuel wholesaling company. Right in our traditional territory, we have Cold Lake Air Force Base and also Primrose Air Weapons Range. And we have been unable to get through the bureaucracy with our company, Polar Oils, to be able to register to be able to bid on the supply of fuel to any of those services that exist by the military in our traditional territory. So it's just so cumbersome that our management group just does not have time to focus specifically on that. They cannot find their way through or find the resources to find their way through to get completely registered to be able to begin bidding. It's extremely cumbersome.
Thank you, Tina, and appreciate that. And it's something we need to learn to make the system better. I'm going to move on quickly because we have two other great witnesses today. So, Mr. Louie and Mr. Buffalo, I'm going to ask you each the same question and give you a chance to both answer it. It'll be efficient that way. You both, in some of the material and then the meetings I've had with you in the past, you talk about the contaminated sites and the reclamation of those sites and what economic impacts that could have on many First Nations across the country. So my question for each of you would simply be, can you kind of expand a little bit on the impact that these sites and the reclamation of these sites could have on Indigenous businesses, maybe in the short term through the process of reclaiming them, but secondly, in the longer term, from the benefits that would be achieved by those First Nations to have access to that land as they try to raise capital and have future economic prosperity in their nation. So, Mr. Buffalo, maybe you can go first, and then Mr. Louie, if you'd follow up answering the same question, please.
Thank you, MP Gary Riddell. I appreciate the question. Yes, in my territory where I am from, Treaty 6 Samson Cree Nation, Pigeon Lake, we had a world-class oil field, the Bonnie Glen Pool. And in that area, exploration had started probably in the late 60s. And obviously, our community boundaries aren't getting any bigger. and the oil and gas has come and kind of gone, but the remnants is still there. So the reclamation is very important, and what it's provided for us is the ability to start taking care of the land again. And in the case in Pigeon Lake, when we can reclaim some of the land, then we can proceed with the more housing project, and there could be some commercial opportunities as well. But, for the most part, we're eliminating the methane emissions from these old abandoned wells. And I think that's very important and goes along with the government's issue on carbon. And it's been very well. We had training program for this site rehabilitation program. We've put over 300 young people to work, and they're doing their part in cleaning the environment.
Thank you, Mr. Bedell, for your question. Environmental contamination is a big topic, a big issue for us, and I touched upon it briefly in my legacy aspect of the barriers. Firstly, with regard to our communities that have land codes, we have 103 operational land codes, 194 signatories that we deal with, and we're directly or indirectly dealing with 238 First Nations, which represents about 1/3 of all First Nations in Canada. And many of our communities have environmental contamination issues. And what's happening with those issues is that it's preventing development. Not having clean water in some communities, sewage services, power, energy problems. All of this is critical infrastructure. There is hundreds of millions of dollars of contamination to the sites that our communities can't develop. I know that's a study, outdated now. Study in 2014 estimated $2.6 billion in estimated cost from environmental contamination. Right now, in our communities alone, we have over 800 reserve parcels that are contaminated that have direct effect. These 800 reserve parcels are distracting from the economic development potential that can happen, must happen. We need cleanup, we need remediation, and we can't have peoples from offside coming to try and contaminate further. And we need laws in place, and we need those laws recognized. We have the power to put environmental laws in place. What we need now is enforcement, and that is a real significant issue, because if our communities say, hey, this site is being contaminated, it's costing us dollars and time and so forth, we've got the power to put environmental laws, but we're having problems with governments to say, let's help us enforce them, provincially, federally. So it's a combined issue. It's costing the country and our communities hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's a serious barrier to economic development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vidal. Mr. Pawlowski, you have 6 minutes.
Hello, and I'd like to welcome Robert Louie. We've spoken a few times. If I recall correctly, it was about the First Nations Land Management Act and the problem in enforcing that act and bylaws made under that act. And I think we broadened that discussion. It wasn't just about enforcing bylaws made under the First Nations Land Management Act, but in general, the problems with enforcing laws in First Nations communities. Mr. Louie, perhaps you could talk a little bit more about that, how your problems in enforcing that law, bylaws made under that law, impact on businesses in First Nations communities, and perhaps if you'd like to expand that on the problems in enforcing laws in general on businesses in First Nations communities.
You're muted, Mr. Louie.
My apologies. Thank you very much, Honourable Member. This is a very good question. The enforcement issue is a big issue. Let me put it this way. We have lawmaking powers. Government supported us to become self-governing for our communities. Now, government just can't say, here is a lawmaking powers. We open this up for you. We need now support for enforcement, and that support will help us to enforce our laws. And right now, the RCMP and other provincial and other agencies are not stepping up to the plate. And so enforcement is a broad issue. You cannot have government, a successful government, toothless. You need a government that has the powers that are going to be backed up by courts. So right now we have problems by the RCMP backing up the laws that are being put forward, and they're significant laws as well. They include trespass. They include private prosecution. They include community health-related matters related to COVID, things of that nature. And if the RCMP doesn't back up the laws, we have a problem. We have a problem with overall governance, because you cannot have a government that doesn't have the enforcement, because you're going to miss out in economic development opportunities and all of the other major things that happen. So the stronger you have a government, particularly lawmaking, with powers to a First Nation to actually lawmake, to put laws in place, the more comfort you're going to bring to those First Nation communities to be supported by financial banking institutions, by investors, and all of that. So it's a major problem. I can give you all kinds of other examples that are happening throughout the country. Family courts in Ontario, for example, refusing to apply land code laws when considering marital disputes. That stops land from being traded between lands being dealt with, lessening opportunities. We're seeing these issues arise, and it's a serious problem. It's nationwide. We need government support. We've made the overtures to this committee. We've made overtures to the ministers and attorney generals. We're in fact working with various attorney generals. We have some pilot projects underway, but it's too slow. We need to get government serious to say, let's get enforcement in place. Let's support our communities. It's deterring other communities from wanting land codes, because if you have a law and the community finds out, well, gee whiz, how do we know we have enforcement? How do you get buy-in from community members? How do you get other First Nations to want to participate? We know we can be successful with lawmaking, but we need enforcement backed up.
I absolutely agree, and I think for most businesses, they want certainty in terms of rule making and enforcement, and that's important for businesses. I think, and I'm looking over at Gary, I think one of our recommendations coming out on our what was it, when our study on enforcing laws in Indigenous communities, we made a recommendation that the government was supposed to report back within a year or a year and a half to this committee on what the government has done with respect to this. Have you heard anything from the government in response to that requirement? Have there been any overtures from anyone in government talking to you about this issue?
We have about 50 seconds left.
Very preliminary. We haven't really got down to the nitty gritty of let's make things happen. It's slow, bureaucracy is slow, and we're having troubles getting the ministerial response granted. There has been an election. I think that's perhaps been part of the problem, but nonetheless, the 1 year hasn't been complied with as a recommendation. It needs attention, and it needs attention desperately, needs it now.
20 seconds.
Mr. Buffalo, I'm sure you're aware of the conflict that's going on in the Ukraine. The Prime Minister announced February 28th we'd no longer be bringing in crude oil from Russia, importing it. I know you work with Indigenous communities that are involved in supply of oil and gas. Can you help the Ukrainian community and bring us some more oil and gas, both for the sake of Canada and Ukraine?
You know, I know,
Mr. Buffalo, you have about 30 seconds.
yeah, they're pushing hard for the advocacy to continue, obviously, in having our place. You know, as Chief Robert mentioned, you know, like we have a special operating agency, Indian Oil and Gas Canada, and they don't work for us with that regulation. And the land is important to us, but, you know, by all means, if we can find a way to work with the government of Canada to do some exporting, that would be fantastic, not only for First Nations, but for Canadians in general.
Thank you, Mr. Pawlowski. Madame Gill, vous avez...
You have 6 minutes, Ms. Gill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses for their presentations, Mr. Louis, Mr. Buffalo, and Ms. Rasmussen. I have a question for Mr. Louis, which is rather broad, but you had a very structured and specific presentation where you explained during the last round of questions as well, more details about some of those aspects. But you know very well what the barriers are and what some of the solutions can be. So what would you recommend to the committee to make sure that some of those solutions are brought in? Do you have some priorities? What would those be? Obviously, a number of things can be done at the same time. Everything was very well presented, but why can't solutions be found more readily? Thank you.
I would love to answer that question. I found my mute button on English way too late, and I apologize. I want desperately to answer the question. I'm going to have that question posed again. I've just got my interpretation button on now.
Allez-y, Madame.
Please go ahead, Ms. Gill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll give her the time from the top, right? Okay, thanks. Sorry. Thank you.
Le temps pour Monsieur Louis. Alors, Monsieur Louis.
So, thank you, Mr. Louis. What I was saying was, well, I thanked all of the witnesses for their testimony and their presentations. I wanted to speak to you, particularly because you mentioned 5 barriers that you had solutions to propose for. You gave additional explanations during your answers to the questions. So can you make some recommendations? You talked about barriers. You talked about some solutions. Why aren't those solutions being brought in? And I would like you to just tell us what needs to be done very clearly so that we can make the right recommendations.
Thank you. Very, very, very very much. This is very good. Well, let me speak maybe to something as straightforward as additions to reserves, for example. Additions to reserves is preventing many communities from accessing economic development opportunities. In Manitoba, for example, the Campion barracks process for those communities that want to pass their land codes and want to have the access to very valuable lands could create billions of dollars of possibilities here. So one recommendation that I believe the committee could help us with is that in the ATR submissions, we need to have, in our recommendation, a First Nation-led entity that leads these addition to reserve submissions so that they can be heard by relevant ministers. First Nations needs to have capacity bolstered to replace the Indian Services bureaucracy. There has to be statutory deadlines for settlement. There has to be stronger dispute resolutions to speed up the process. And there has to be different partnerships or arrangements with neighboring provincial and municipal governments to better tackle joint planning. These are very significant issues. There could be standard agreements for the additions to reserve transition. So we need First Nation entities with the capacity and the funding to succeed. So these are some of the issues that I think bode very well for the for additions to reserve. Now, enforcement, of course, again, we need to have a strong body.
Si je pouvais me permettre, Monsieur Louis, je veux pas...
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just have very little time. I would really like you to be very specific about solutions. You know so much about so many aspects. So I would like to know why you think that the solutions that you have suggested have not been put into place already. Why have they not been done, even though you've laid out all these solutions?
Thank you. I'll try and be even more specific. Well, let's take enforcement. It's a big, big issue. As I've indicated, enforcement is not happening. We're not getting the full support. We believe a strong recommendation that this committee could consider and recommend that Canada needs to appoint a permanent special advisor to the Federal Minister of Justice to help solve enforcement challenges. We would love to be involved in that process. We know where the enforcement lacks, and we know where partnerships fail, and they're failing all over. So that is one clear aspect. With regard to the land registry issues, we're working on a new lands registry. We're working with the BC province in their land registry system to develop a controlled and run First Nation-led entity. We're making advancements on that. We need commitment of dollars. We have those discussions underway. We have some temporary funding, but this is a big issue because that's going to pave the way for a much better land registry system. So that is a very significant
Merci, Monsieur Louis. Je vais pas vous...
Thank you, Mr. Louis. I don't want to interrupt you, but I would like to ask Ms. Rasmussen question as well. She has a lot of experience with the industrial investments and your small and medium-sized businesses. I would like to know from her a little bit more about the difficulties that these businesses are facing. If she could please tell us that.
Thank you very much for the question. Majority of the opportunities, I guess, are held back by investment, access to financing. It's very difficult sometimes in First Nations communities to be able to lever access to finance to do business expansion. So it becomes, for us, in business development, all of our money is intended to go directly back to serve our First Nations communities and benefit the First Nations communities individually to support all of those social programs. So when we're trying to do business development, sometimes you're not on an even playing field with organizations. For those of us in the forest industry, the companies that we go up against are often international companies with very large bankrolls and often very many site locations in comparison to the mom and pop operation of us as a sawmiller. So we're just not on the same playing field, basically, and the opportunity is not there for us to access the same amount of financing, to go to the bank in the same way, to stockpile those reserves to do increases or advancements or changes are just not there, because we're not paying an individual family here. We're supporting entire communities through economic development.
Merci, Madame Gill.
Thank you, Ms. Gill. Ms. Idlow, you have 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, I wish to welcome you all. Your presentations were very interesting. I have to ask a question to Mr. Buffalo. You mentioned, I take note of your comment that to support UNDRIP is to support Indigenous communities, regardless of industry, including in oil and gas. This is a critical issue of consent. And the duty to consult and to ensure consent, which is so often overlooked. With this in mind, my question is, how is free, prior, and informed consent central to IRC's process and approvals for oil and gas projects? That is my question to Mr. Buffalo. Thank you.
Yeah, I truly appreciate, this discussion into the UNDRIP. There's a lot of articles, Article 3 and Article 4, as to in the community determining their own right and political will as to moving to sustain their culture and their heritage, and we obviously support that. And what we found with a lot of these bills that have come forward from the federal government, it's been always one-sided. In regards to Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act, a lot of the communities under the Indian Resource Council were not consulted, but yet the act passed. The tanker ban as well. A lot of the communities that did support the initiative were not consulted, but the act passed. And free, prior, and informed consent is definitely up to the community. And I've even asked our good colleague here, Chief Robert Louis, his opinion on it. And it's something that needs to be further discussed in going down as we move towards really having the United Nations Declaration as the staple, because some communities have the process of electing a leader through democracy. We're hearing democracy being called out in the House today, as to how important that is. And with communities that have their own hereditary leadership, it's up to them to figure that part out as to who decides for the community. And I hope the best for everyone. But at the end of the day, regardless of what happens, this tool of UNDRIP is definitely an opportunity for First Nations to get out of poverty. Because as we all know, we want our own dependency, our own sovereignty. We want to be, I call it being under the Indian Act, soft communism. It doesn't help in being told how to spend money and what to do. Despite some of the issues in regards to the climate change and everything like that, trying to find a balance of economic development and protecting the environment is what we should be striving for. And to get ourselves, again, like I said, out of poverty. A lot of communities are very fortunate to have a geographic location, are very fortunate to be beside a major infrastructure and are very part of it, and their communities benefit. But there are a lot that aren't by a major center, that struggle with getting to hospital, that struggle with having clean water, that struggle with proper health care, and everything as such. So we just hope that utilizing this sector and utilizing the UNDRIP, we find that balance, not only for First Nations to benefit, but for all of Canada.
Thank you. Another question? Your company is called the Indian Resource Council. If you were to consult with the community and they wanted the project to go ahead, but if they refuse the project, how do you go about dealing with the communities who are not in favor of the project?
Thank you for the question, and of course, it's really up to the community to decide, and we do not have any influence either way. At the end of the day, we want to present the opportunities themselves. We don't try to force any community to getting something that they do not want to get into. But the current state that we're in, the alternative is rely on the Indian Act, rely on being told what to do. That's the current state, and again, I'm hoping some leaderships can find the unique ways of utilizing economic development to sustain themselves. The community has to decide themselves, and then again, we do not try to persuade them or influence them either way. But if they require information as to data, as to what's happening in the real world, that's what we're there for, to provide that kind of capacity support.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sidlaut. This brings this panel to conclusion. I want to thank Mr. Louis, I want to thank Ms. Rasmussen, and I want to thank Mr. Buffalo for taking the time to come and speak to us and to answer our questions. This will help us in our examination of the barriers to economic development. Your testimony is very important. Thank you very much. If the second panel is ready, we will proceed in the interest of time with the second panel. For everybody's information here, in the second panel, we have, nous avons avec nous aujourd'hui.
We have with us Marie-Christine Tremblay from the Commission de développement économique des Premières Nations du Québec and Labrador. We have
Mockwatch. And we have Chief Gregory Desjardins from Frog Lake First Nation. Without further ado, sans plus tarder, Madame Marie-Christine Tremblay, vous avez le microphone.
Ms. Tremblay, you have 5 minutes for your presentations. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to your committee. I want to take the opportunity to raise 4 issues. I know that I only have 5 minutes, which isn't very much. And the first issue is postal rates that are making things difficult for First Nations in Quebec and Canada. The cost for shipping packages that are assumed by companies and residents on First Nations are much higher than what is paid in surrounding communities. And this situation results especially from how major shipping companies set their prices, in particular when it comes to online commerce, which is increasingly popular. The postal code system in Canada, which was established by Canada Post, has 2 sequences of letters and numbers, and we have the first letter the first part of it is the sortation area, and then the local delivery unit is the last part. In Quebec, all postal codes start with GH or J, and the second digit, a number, is between 0 and 9. Rural and remote regions always have a 0 in the second position of the postal code. There are communities that were originally rural. For example, Wendake and Ganawagi were rural areas, but no longer are. And they have a 0 in that second place, the second part of their postal code. Now, the main shipping companies like Purolator, UPS, and so on set their pricing based on 6 criteria. And among these, there are 3 that take into account the prefix of the postal code. These are the distance between the destination and where the package was sent from, the distance from a sortation center, and the population density. Now, these areas that used to be rural and no longer are penalized, because if a package is sent, for example, from Wendake to Sherbrooke, it will cost $14.77. But if it was sent from Quebec City, it would cost only $12.02. That's 23% less. Another example is a package sent from Wendake to Wendake will cost $14.06, but from Quebec City to Quebec City, only $9.41, which is a difference of 49%. A package sent from Wendake to Wendake will cost more than a package sent from Quebec City to Baie-Comeau, even though that distance is 400 kilometers, and there is a ferry in there as well. So that is a very significant disparity. For a company that is mainly online and has to send a large number of packages every day, this extra cost can amount to thousands of dollars a year. The situation also has impacts on regular residents in Indigenous communities who also have to pay higher prices for their regular purchases. The financial losses due to this inherent racism amounts to millions of dollars for companies and First Nations members. There are 2 possible solutions to this situation. The first would be to change the postal codes for Indigenous communities that are now urban. That would be more complicated because it requires several levels of government to work together, but it would certainly fix the problem. The other solution could be done in parallel and would be more simple. It would mean that the government would require shippers to take into account the full postal code, both parts of it, in their pricing. So this is a very important situation so that Indigenous communities can be as competitive and they can make as much money doing the same thing as their can I go to my second? You've already gone beyond your 5 minutes, so I'll give you 30 seconds. Otherwise, we will ask you questions so you can develop your other points. Thank you very much, Ms. Tremblay.
Gladue, let me apologize for calling you Miss Gladue. You're evidently not Miss Gladue. So please, you have 5 minutes. Maybe I'll give you an extra 15 seconds considering my faux pas.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me, honorable members of the committee. My name is Mr. J.P. Gladue. I'm calling in from Sandpoint First Nation, which is actually just northeast of Thunder Bay. Just want to give you a little bit more of what I'm doing so you'll understand more where my comments are coming from. I'm also on the board of Suncor, a couple mining companies, chair of the Board of Leadership Champions as an environmental group, chair of the Energy Futures Lab around future transition of energies, as well as Canadian Forest Trust, which is an organization to meet the 2 billion trees commitment. And the reason why I tell you these, I'm around a lot of our Indigenous issues. And I'm incredibly grateful for the government. And I'm going to go back to my time at the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business when I was the CEO, when Mark Little and I from Suncor came to the Hill to express the success that Suncor was having in our procurement work with Indigenous communities. Today, we're encroaching on $1 billion spend with local Indigenous businesses. So it's great to see the government commit to a 5% target. I encourage the government to keep on this track. I know, talking to some of my colleagues, there are still plenty of challenges ahead. We have to drive that down the supply chain. As communities get access to business activity, you build the experience. Experience is a great teacher, and that's how we actually build our economies. So without those access to those business opportunities, it's very difficult to be on par, economic par with the rest of the country. Incredibly important. It's also incredibly important that Canadians understand that the success of our country is closely tied to the relationships with Indigenous communities. And so when we start to comprehend this more, so there's a big education piece and ignorance that still exists in Canada, and we've got to get over the ignorance that still exists, because my last point, when I come back to it, you'll understand why. Capital pools have been spoken about, I'm sure, a number of times. The fact that the Canadian Infrastructure Bank has the $1 billion fund is amazing. Don't stop there. There's $35 billion deficit in our communities alone. Never mind this net zero energy transition that our country is talking about. If we're going to get there in a successful way, we need to deepen and widen the capital pools so that our communities can be equitable members in any activity in our traditional territories. With UNDRIP unpacking, if we don't get the relationships right, as I mentioned, Canada's success is closely tied to our Indigenous communities. I can point to countless numbers where because of the poor relationships, we've lost opportunities because we're such a naturally rich, endowed country. I want to see more backstop or loans for communities to access to be able to participate. And it was brought up in the previous panel, so I won't go too deep there. I'd love to see stronger relationships with provincial governments, with availability payments to support infrastructure projects so communities can rely on cash flow as they develop their relationships and partnerships in all sorts of infrastructure projects that are going to continue to go on in our country. The last thing I wanted to address is that we need an overall strategy on the Indigenous economy. There's lots of great ideas. There's incredible Indigenous leaders at the table giving you ideas, but until you have a strategy that you can rely on, you're going to be all over the map. Work with organizations like the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business or the National Aboriginal Capital Corporation Association to help develop you those strategies and to do it alongside you. It was really great to see, and I'm a big fan of ministering, to see the international trade export promotion, the small business. You've got to find better, shorter organizations. It's going to take me half my time to get through it. And the economic development support for the Black North Initiative. That's fantastic. North of $20 million being committed to that organization, to the number of Black organizations. That is not happening in our Indigenous community. We need to care, we need to believe, and we need to do. And I think the government cares. As an example, and I'm going to leave it here. When I was at the helm of CCAB, the government cared enough to ask us to submit a proposal for the budget to support Indigenous entrepreneurs. We submitted. The budget came out in 2019. And not only did we not get it in the budget, and that happens, but the government committed $3 million to Futurepreneur to actually support Indigenous entrepreneurs. That's not the belief that I expect from our country, to believe in Indigenous people. That is not the way that we're going to build relationships. You need to empower the Indigenous organizations that have proven track records to support our own people. Why do we have to go back to the non-Indigenous organizations to beg for resources to support our own people when we've got that capacity? So you have to care, you have to believe, and you've got to do by supporting our Indigenous organizations, or we're going to be back spinning our wheels. Thank you for your time, Honourable Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Gladue. We now have Chief Gregory Desjardins. Mr. Desjardins, you have 5 minutes.
Greetings, everybody. Thankful for this opportunity. I just want to say I'm grateful to the Creator first and foremost. What I want to talk about and what I want to share is, to talk about economic sovereignty first and foremost with Indigenous people. I look at Alberta and I did some research. I look at the NRTA that was transferred from the federal government to the province of Alberta. First Nations don't benefit from the natural resources. So it's almost been 100 years. I think it's time for us to get it right. How do we as First Nations assist Canada in becoming good treaty partners? We have to remember that handshake back in 1876. And I look, as First Nations are part of the solution. First Nations were never part of the problem. So we have to remember that, my friends. I look at the economic support that First Nations require, that industry has benefited over the years, decades. That's the kind of involvement in capital that First Nations need. If you want to help First Nations become sustainable, remove poverty, you have to offer them that seed capital that industry has been beneficial over the years. First Nations led projects. You look at these pipelines, you look at these refineries in the heartland of Alberta. You look at the power of the heartland community. Frog Lake and Gehewen are the only First Nations led proposal for the carbon sequestration. It's like David and Goliath, but we have no choice to get involved with the parade instead of watching it go by. You look at with participation of First Nations, this allows environmental oversight on these projects. I am a businessman as a chief, but I'm also a Sundance person who picks medicines and who goes to ceremony. I had to find a balance because ceremony won't sustain my people. Business will. But how do I build homes on an outdated CFA? I have to get involved in economics. So that's what we need to do as First Nations people. You look at these projects, example again, the Trans Mountain Pipeline. You look at Indigenous ownership. If you involve the First Nations, you allow them to build homes. You allow them to send kids to school. You allow them to send people to treatment. You allow them to deliver water to these homes. You allow them to remove mold. You see, that's problem solving. That's a takeaway. Instead of all the money leaving Canada and still having poor First Nations living on CFAs and begging for handouts. We need to look at what is happening across the world. In our friends in the Ukraine, it's about world power. It shouldn't be about power. And we're learning, our children are learning these things. We need to have economic reconciliation with the First Nations. And we have to be involved in these major projects. I'm offering solutions. You look at what was given here just recently, the site, the SRP, the reclamation project of Alberta in Saskatchewan, where many companies went through our nations and made millions of dollars, but left their liability behind. I'm thankful for this program. It put people to work. We almost went bust, even during this COVID with this negative oil price. Frog Lake at the peak, we were 10,000 barrels, but today we're 400 barrels a day. So we are trying, like many First Nations, to be oilmen, businessmen. We're trying different things. We created a concrete company out of nothing on the reserve here. And many First Nations are doing this. It depends on your geography, where you are in Canada, how close you are to cities, and what you're able to grow in your backyard. So I think that needs to be in the minds of our leaders as well. And we're asking in Alberta also for that program is for an extension. I just wanted to get that out there because it's needed for all sectors to strive and to do this program properly. We're able to put these leases back to the natural grass state or as close to where we can grow medicines again. So I just wanted to share some of these highlights, that we need as First Nations people, because we cannot live in this poverty. It's 2022 and many nations don't even have fresh water. So some of the barriers are the seed capital, the investment side that we don't have. If you're a CFA band just living on your CFA, your contribution funding agreement, how can you be involved? First and foremost, that's part of the picture I want to paint. If you don't have a willing partner or the natural resources beneath you, how can you be involved? So the solutions that Canada has to realize is ownership and revenue sharing of major projects across Canada. Keep the money in Canada, help the First Nations stand on their feet, and have economic reconciliation. Look what's happening across.
So I'll have to ask you to wrap it up, Chief Desjardins.
Okay, I want to thank everybody in the House for listening. I want to thank my MP, Shannon Stubbs, for allowing us to come and to share and to watch for Frog Lake and many of the First Nations who are trying to be at these tables and to help solve the problem of poverty across Canada and make the life of these unborn a better life the way it was supposed to be in the shared land when the treaty was signed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Desjardins. We'll now proceed to the first round of questions. Mr. Gladue, I'm told that you are currently on the microphone for the computer as opposed to the microphone for your headset. I don't know if you know how to do that on Zoom, but to switch, it helps the interpreters to understand a little bit better. So just while you're doing that, we'll proceed to the first. It will be 6 minutes for the Conservatives. I have Ms. Stubbs here on the list. For the Conservatives and the Liberals, given that we only have limited time, if you want to share it with another member, feel free to do it, but you have 6 minutes. But it's over to you, Ms. Stubbs.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate that. Thank you to all of the witnesses for being here and to Chief Desjardins for always reminding me in Treaty 6 that we're all treaty people. And we should always have that in our mind as we work together. I know that JP has said multiple times that it is important for Indigenous communities to be able to move from systemic poverty to exactly what you're talking about, Chief, economic reconciliation and economic and self-determination through economic self-sufficiency. I wonder, Chief Desjardins, if you would like to tell Canadians in the committee a little bit more about all of your accomplishments and achievements as a community through your many years of responsible resource development as owners and partners in the sector, as well as recent initiatives you've undertaken. Of course, no surprise, leading the way on innovation and responsibility and environmental responsibility with some future aspirations.
Yeah, I can remember back in the 80s when some chiefs and leaders had a vision to create Pimby Well servicing. We employ about 150 First Nations, and we own jointly with 7 bands, 13 service rigs. Also the creation of 7 lakes. We employ over 400 people with 52 bands in Western Canada represented. And we serve Synovus, Imperial, and different industry companies around the federal bombing range. Just recently, we had one of our counselors create LEAP, and that's a huge project that we're leading the way. We were successful in some grants, and we're trying to look at carbon capture. And like I shared earlier, we're one of the 58 proposals in the heartland by Edmonton, which is Fort Saskatchewan, that is Indigenous led. We talk about the Western Indigenous Pipeline, and I want to say to everybody, and many of you probably heard the name of Joe Dion, who we second to the group to formulate a plan to bring all the nations along the corridor to try vie for ownership. And at the peak, I said Frog Lake was 10,000 barrels, and whoever had that insight to drill the first well in Frog Lake in 1967, I think about them today. They're probably not with us, or they're in the spirit world. But that's the kind of insight, and that's what I was left to deal with here as the chief. You know, but we're trying our best to create these opportunities for our people, and with that became the creation of FLIRC, Frog Lake Energy Resources. And just recently, we signed another deal with Westlake Energy. So instead of punching holes on top of the ground, the technology will be putting many fingers, or I think that's what they were calling, down below the surface. You know, and I think when we look at carbon sequestration, and we're looking about the air quality, that the emitters pollute the air, and how do we leave Mother Earth in a state for our young people and the ones that are yet to come? You look at fresh water. All these things are for all of us and everybody on the call. It's not just for First Nations. You look at the polar caps that are melting. You look at the call from 2050 to have zero carbon emission. But how do we get there together? You know, and I just think that we're trying to lead the way, because we've always been part of the solution as First Nations people, and we've been talking about this because somebody's weed is somebody's cure to cancer. When industry says, "Oh, that's just the weed," it's not true, because it's somebody's cure to cancer or some major illness. So I just wanted to share that much with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And Chief, the revenue from your resource companies over decades, they were used to build homes, to offset tuition for hundreds of college and university students, to build an arena, a field house, a chuckwagon racetrack. You've provided jobs for Indigenous people in your community and for people in the entire region, non-Indigenous and otherwise. Would you like to speak? Of course, a lot of that work is dependent on sufficient pipeline infrastructure. So would you like to speak to the experience so far and any barriers you've faced in terms of being involved in the Indigenous-led group to purchase TMX?
Well, I think what needs to happen is we need to have better communication. And we have to have a vision about making Canada a better place for all people, all First Nations, and owning up to the wrongs of decades of the wrongdoing of the First Nations people. Because look what happened in Gruard. I was born 20 miles from Gruard in High Prairie, and there was an announcement today of these graves. So let's not hide the wrongs. Let's make it right. And let's have better communication. And let's take First Nations seriously. Let's help them become owners of major infrastructure, that we can help them build homes, and we can help them send more kids to school. I have a population from 18 to 30, 900 kids. So what do the other 800 do? Start a family young, maybe join a gang, maybe sell some drugs, or start, leave the reserve. These are only the options. If you don't have an economy on a First Nation, you have to think of something, or you live on welfare and show your kids that. So why can't we work with the First Nations to stand them up where they can show their kids a generation of hard work? But I think some of the barriers and what needs to really happen is we need to be offered the capital and these loans that we could pay them back over time, but we could benefit and get into these major projects that would help. Because you know what? We need to have the oil leave Canada, and we need to have this sector, because for many years, Canada has benefited from the dirty tar sands that people call it, but we'll graciously take the dividend, but the First Nations, you don't get that dividend. You know where the First Nation starts, because the county grader turns around and goes back and grades towards the taxpayers as per se. And that's what the NRTA has really done to our people. It really has put us in the poverty level, where we're begging, where we should be working together to try and make a better Canada for us. So I think the biggest barrier is not having that capital. But I think we are serious and we want to own these infrastructures like the TMX, and the Western Indigenous Pipeline Group that's from Treaty 6 all the way to the coast. Some of these chiefs say they watch these tankers leave, but they also watch these whales flip, but they don't get a dime off that tanker. So how do we come together and make this a reality? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chief Desjarlais. Thank you, Ms. Stubbs. We'll now go to Ms. Atwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. Et peut-être je vous donne l'opportunité à...
Maybe I would give Ms. Trombley an opportunity to continue her presentation and talk to us about her second issue. I think it was about jobs growth. Thank you very much for giving me that opportunity to continue. I will be very brief, but I wanted to talk about the Fund for Employment and Growth, which is a program administered by the Quebec federally funded agency. And the problem is that the documentation for the program indicates clearly that organizations and businesses that are led by Indigenous people are strongly encouraged to present an application, but it does not really indicate in the guide who is eligible, who is not. It says that there are exceptions that can apply to Indigenous businesses, but there needs to be more clarification. There needs to be more transparency around these criteria, because we need to know what the criteria are that will determine whether a business is eligible or not for the program. Just reading the information documents should enable Indigenous applicants to decide themselves whether they are eligible, because without more clarity, then it could seem like bureaucrats are just being arbitrary in their decisions.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for that.
To ask possibly Chief Desjarlais, we had Stephen Buffalo from the Indian Resource Council of Canada just on before you, and he really set up kind of this dichotomy of choice in that he said, it's between oil and gas or the Indian Act. And I'd just like to see what your comments are around that. Are there other sectors you really would feel you'd like to get into, or is this really, for your region and your community that, do you feel that oil and gas is kind of the main contributor and the main opportunity, or, is it really that dichotomy, or are there other options available?
I think there's other areas, and I don't just speak for Frog Lake. I look at the fisheries, I look at the salmon, and I also look at the wind projects. And we've talked with Northland before, and we tried to get one of the projects that were in southern Alberta, because we have no choice. It's either you try and find a partner and get involved, or you just sit back and do nothing. And oil and gas, it fluctuates, we all know. And there was a time we were getting an invoice instead of getting a dividend. So, and you also look at the solar, but without the federal and provincial programs, you can't get involved if you don't have the capital, and you look at logging but also at the same time, as a First Nation, you look at the air, because we all know trees, they give off the natural oxygen, for all the air for us to breathe. And by removing all the trees, we're cutting our life short over there for the unborn. You know what? So just trying to be diverse in the best way we can, and looking at different ways, you know, to offset First Nations. And also, you look at the announcements in the province of Alberta about paving and job stimulation. Well, how come Frog Lake or other First Nations can't provide pavement and the infrastructure instead of just providing 2 flaggers on a paving of 50 kilometers? Why can't we be the lead in the prime contractor? And those are the kind of things that we have to look at as leaders of Canada. How do we solve these problems? You know, so we have to look bigger and believe that we can do it, because we can do it. You know what? And I sell power. We have a cogen here. It's called Strathcona. We own the cogen facility. We own land in Lloyd, 140 acres. When I got in as a chief, we had very little revenue, but we did not sell nothing. We adjusted. I don't have a business degree, but I have a lot of common sense. And that's what we have to be recognizant. Trust each other, communicate with each other, and give each other the chance to succeed. Because the government, you have the ability to impact the lives of thousands of First Nations people in a good or negative way. Let's choose to impact them in a good way, because we're all treaty people. When our ancestors signed that treaty, it was to share. There was no inclusion of our resources that we can't even benefit after almost 100 years. So maybe when those kind of discussions happen, then I would have a better, clear, concise answer to what is more available to the First Nations besides oil and gas.
Well, thank you very much. That was excellent.
You have 18 seconds.
18 seconds. Well, I think I'll just use the time again to just thank you all so much. And Mr. Gladio, I didn't get to ask you a question, but I really appreciate what you shared with us today. And so I wish you all well, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Ms. Atwin. Madame Gill, à vous la parole.
Ms. Gill, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also like to thank all 3 witnesses, Mr. Gladue, Mr. Desjardins, and Ms. Tremblay, for their very helpful presentations. The time goes very quickly. We would have liked to hear from each of you more in depth. I thought Ms. Tremblay's point about Canada Post and the postal codes as a situation where there is inherent racism was very interesting. And I wonder whether you feel that the situation is the same elsewhere in northern Quebec, for example. I just wanted to get clarification about that, and I would like to hear from you a little bit more about the federal Economic Development Agency in Quebec and its rules and how that is prejudicial to Indigenous companies as well, and perhaps procurement as well. I would really like to hear what you have to say about procurement. Thank you very much. I'll be trying to answer very quickly to all of those points. Yes, the situation for the postal codes also exists elsewhere, though I mentioned Wendake and Ganawagi. In the study that we did, about 100 First Nations across the country were in that situation where the postal code indicated that they were rural, but in fact they were not. Thank you. Just very quickly, you talked about the postal code, but I just would like you to say why Canada, when we have Indigenous communities trying to do online commerce, even if they are rural, they tend to be in a more difficult situation. Do you have any recommendations that go beyond the shipping companies, but that things that could be resolved by Canada Post? Well, yes, of course. These days, people are increasingly using online business methods, and we want Indigenous communities to be able to do business across the country and even around the world. So the recommendation certainly could be used across Canada. So could you talk about procurement a little bit for First Nations and Indigenous businesses? Very quickly. Yes, I'll be trying to be very concise on this. Of course, when it comes to procurement, as you all know, in 2019, the government decided to allocate a percentage of government procurement to Indigenous businesses. I'm not sure how it works across the country, but here there are few cases of procurement. The government says it wants to meet this target, but it doesn't really know what is offered by Indigenous businesses. Not all business owners know how to access the tendering processes. Often they get discouraged. The businesses have overall had negative experiences with trying to do business with the government. So we think that there needs to be a solution to this kind of distrust that has developed. We've identified a partial solution that might be to have procurement leads be able to allow contracts for, say, less than $25,000 without a competitive process. And they could have certain criteria that they could apply. This could create good opportunities for businesses that may find it difficult to go through the more detailed tendering process, because often these businesses don't know really how to go about things. And this would be an important way of fixing it. We would need to have very clear criteria that these businesses would be able to meet. There could be consultations. And the idea would be to start with low-value contracts and then build from there so that there are models available for the businesses, allowing them to get their foot in the door for government procurement. It would give them assurance and confidence and learn how to do the online tendering processes that would be required for higher value contracts. This would be one of the solutions for procurement problems. Thank you. My time is up. Thank you, Ms. Gill. We will now go to Ms. Idlout. You have 6 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to thank all of you for making your presentations today. I will have a question for Marie-Christine Tremblay. You mentioned that you order supplies through the post office. It is a barrier, in Nunavut especially. If I had an option, I would like you to have option number 1, that the federal government support cargo or it's ordering items from outside is Nunavut-wide. That's the only way we get things. I'd like to know how Inuit, Métis, and Inuit who live in faraway countries are very different from your average Canadian city. The cost of living, the distance. Amazon, compared to Amazon, where you order, how are you able to balance the high cost of cargo, and what are your recommendations?
C'est certain que moi, je suis.
I'm not really all that knowledgeable about that situation because the communities that we're more familiar with have the problems of very high delivery costs, and this damages their opportunities for economic development. I would imagine that this is something that would also apply to cargo, but what I'm most familiar with is the area that I talked about. So that's all I can say.
Perhaps I will clarify. I really appreciate your focus on shipping costs as a barrier. The federal government should be able to help with orders that have to come from outside their community. In Nunavut, the high cost of cargo and shipping is a barrier. Many businesses in Nunavut rely on shipping to get their product. But in Nunavut, it's a remote part of Canada, so the cost of cargo is very expensive. Federal government, if they were to pursue and support different ways of shipping items to the communities. Inuit, Métis, and First Nations also have businesses. And which is to suggest that the federal government requires shipping to be taken into account. How would you balance the difference between Inuit, First Nations, Métis, and specifically remote shipping businesses as compared to corporations like Amazon?
Was your question from Ms. Tremblay, Mrs. Loud?
Yes, I was clarifying my question to her.
Okay, Madame Tremblay, est-ce que vous avez entendu?
Did you hear the question, Ms. Tremblay? Please go ahead. Thank you. Well, there is no doubt that the Canadian government should do something to make sure that shipping costs are lower for businesses, and this would make it easier for local shipping as well as wider. This would give an opportunity to businesses that want to provide their services and their products to customers. And this would also enable them to more easily send, say, construction materials to more remote communities. If the government could perhaps legislate reduced shipping prices, then it would help these businesses that often have difficulty covering all the costs for material and equipment. So we certainly strongly recommend that action be taken on that.
Thank you, Ms. Laut. That concludes your 6 minutes. And I want to finish by thanking Jean-Paul Gladue today, Chief Desjardins, and Marie-Christine Tremblay for your presentations and for answering our questions on this very important subject. This is the last of our meetings concerning economic barriers. Your input is very important. We much appreciate it. Thank you very much for appearing today. All the best. And for committee members, I would ask you now we're going to go into committee in camera. For those of you who are there virtually, we're going to stop for 5 minutes so that you can connect to the other link, and we'll resume in 5 minutes. Thank you.
you.